She looked straight into my eyes and changed the night forever. The night was calm, almost unnaturally so. The city lights flickered in the distance, tiny stars mirrored on the river's surface. From high above, in a small craft that hovered unseen, the observer watched. It had been observing humans for decades, collecting patterns, measuring behaviors, and noting the ways in which the species moved through their world. To the observer, humans were loud, messy, and often illogical. But they were fascinating. Tonight was routine. The observer had planned to record nocturnal activity near the riverbank, a common gathering place for humans, according to the data. Small groups wandered along the paths, laughing, talking, or leaning on railings as if the world itself had nothing more important than their chatter. The observer adjusted sensors, capturing every gesture, every shift of attention. Humans rarely noticed it. That was the rule. No human had ever looked straight into the observer's instruments. None had ever acknowledged its presence. That was the rule, too. Until now. It happened quietly. The observer first noticed a flicker of movement, then a pause. A woman had stopped in the middle of the river path. The others in her group continued walking, laughing, unaware, but she did not move. She stared. Not at the moon, not at the river, not even at the city lights. She looked straight toward the observer's location. The observer froze. Sensors confirmed that the camouflage was intact. There was no reflection, no shadow, no hint of its craft. Yet she looked directly at it. No human had ever done this. Her gaze was not accusatory or frightened. It was calm, steady, and deliberate, and it carried a weight the observer could not quantify. There was curiosity, yes, but something more. Something like recognition. The observer's instruments recorded the moment with precision, but even they could not capture the anomaly it was beginning to feel. A strange pulse moved through the observation system. It was not danger. It was not alarm. It was awareness. The human had noticed it. And somehow, it had reacted to the observer in return. It was impossible. The observer was trained for anomalies. Its species had protocols for every unusual event, protocols for deviation in planetary behavior, in social patterns, in emotional response. But this had no protocol. There was no instruction for a human who could see the unseen. For several seconds, the observer debated withdrawing, recording the event as a minor glitch in perception. But the woman did not move. She did not speak. She simply held its gaze. Then, almost imperceptibly, she tilted her head. A simple gesture, but in it was a question. Are you alone? The observer paused. It did not have an answer. Not in words, not in logic. The question bypassed all calculations, all records, all classifications. It was personal. Every decision it had ever made had been guided by observation, not engagement. And yet, something inside it, something it could not define, told it that leaving now would be wrong. The night seemed to hold its breath. The hum of distant traffic, the soft ripple of water, even the wind through the trees, all became background noise. Only the human remained, staring, waiting. The observer's sensors detected something it had never measured before, a resonance. It was subtle, almost indistinct, like the vibration of a distant string. But it was there. It moved through its systems, through its thinking, through its understanding of the universe, and it was tied to her gaze. She did not blink. She did not flinch. She simply looked. For the first time, the observer understood something about humans that no data table could capture. They could communicate without words. They could sense presence without needing instruments. They could perceive truth without needing proof. And they could make the impossible possible. A soft smile formed on her lips. It was not meant to be threatening or comforting. It was simply there, a recognition, a welcome, a challenge, all in one simple motion. The observer did not know how to respond. Its systems whirred, its logic processors ran, but they could not create an action that would match the human's awareness. Every protocol, every guidebook, every instruction failed. It stayed. Minutes passed, though the observer had no way to measure them. Time felt different when observed by someone who could see you without instruments, who could reach inside your systems with nothing but their attention. The world itself seemed to shift slightly. Even the stars appeared different. Finally, the woman spoke. Her voice was soft, barely more than a whisper carried by the wind, but it reached the observer with perfect clarity. "Are you alone?" The observer hesitated. In its language, it had thousands of ways to describe its presence. It had symbols for location, for mass, for energy signatures, for observation protocols, but it had nothing for being alone. It transmitted a simple response, not words, but an image, a small craft, silent, hovering, unseen. A visual representation, limited and incomplete. She saw it. She nodded, as if satisfied. Then she smiled again and turned to walk along the path. She did not run. She did not shout. She simply continued, leaving the observer to contemplate what had just happened. It replayed the event in every system it had. Every calculation ended in the same result. This human had violated all expectations. Not violently, not aggressively, but simply by noticing. For centuries, the observer had been trained to understand civilizations. It had cataloged thousands of worlds, thousands of species, thousands of patterns. None had ever been capable of this. None had ever communicated across the invisible barrier that separated the observer from its subject. It had expected chaos, noise, fear. Instead, it had found recognition. And recognition was dangerous. Because if a human could see it and understand, even in a small way, then all the assumptions about its mission were wrong. If one human could do this, what might others be capable of? What might this species do when fully aware of what lay beyond their world? The observer considered withdrawing, hiding, pretending nothing had happened. But even as it calculated the safest options, it realized it could not. Not yet. Not while the human had looked at it. The night stretched on. The wind whispered through the trees. The city lights reflected in the water, small, distant, unremarkable. Yet the observer could not look away. Not from the woman, not from the presence she had invoked. Something in it had shifted. Something fundamental. For the first time in its career, the observer understood what it meant to be, seen. And for the first time, it feared what it might become if it could not leave this night behind. It waited. Not for the others. Not for the council. Not for instructions. It waited for her. Somewhere in the distance, the faint echo of laughter carried through the air. The night continued, ordinary to everyone else, yet extraordinary in ways no one could measure, and the observer realized that its life, its mission, its understanding of the universe would never be the same again, because she had looked straight into its eyes. And the night had changed forever. The night after the first encounter arrived quietly, without fanfare. The city was alive as usual, cars moving in rhythmic patterns, the faint hum of neon lights, the distant murmur of voices drifting through alleys. But the observer could not focus on routine observation. Its systems, designed for perfect detachment, now carried something unfamiliar: anticipation. It hovered near the same river path, careful to remain unseen. Its instruments tracked every human movement, every shift in light, every subtle vibration in the air. Yet all the careful calculations and predictive models failed to capture what it felt. Not fear, not curiosity. Something else. Something heavy and unfamiliar. The observer had seen humans many times. It had cataloged their gestures, measured their expressions, and analyzed their interactions. But never had it seen one human pause and hold a presence so forceful that it affected the observer itself. Never had it experienced what might be called emotion. She appeared again. The observer noticed her first by her silhouette against the soft glow of the city. She walked alone this time, as if seeking something that only she could understand. She did not look frantic, nor cautious, nor even curious. She moved with purpose, yet lightly, almost as if she were floating. And then, as always, she stopped. Her eyes found the observer's hiding place almost immediately, scanning the shadows, searching the invisible. She did not hesitate. She did not hesitate. She simply looked. The observer tried to remain unseen. Its systems flickered, sensors adjusted, camouflage activated, and yet, somehow, she noticed. Every time. A strange, unmeasured pulse ran through the observer's systems. It was not part of its standard operations. It had no label, no category. The observer realized it was not only aware of being noticed, it was reacting in ways it could not control. She tilted her head again, the same subtle movement as before. The observer felt, what? Surprise? Admiration? Confusion? None of these labels fit. It was an internal disturbance, a breach of every protocol it had learned. Then, almost imperceptibly, she whispered again, "You are here again." The words were simple, but they carried a calm certainty that unsettled the observer. Humans rarely spoke with precision. They were messy, chaotic, often illogical, and yet here was a human speaking truthfully, calmly, without need for demonstration. The observer considered responding. It could transmit signals, create images, even produce sounds, but none of these options felt appropriate. None of its tools could communicate the truth. I see you, and I do not know why this matters, but it does. The woman did not move closer. She did not gesture or beckon. She simply stood, radiating attention without aggression, recognition without intrusion. The observer realized she had no fear. In her presence, the usual laws of observation did not apply. Its species had trained it to expect alarm, chaos, panic. She offered none of these. Minutes passed, measured by instruments, yet stretched in ways the observer could not define. It felt drawn forward, compelled by something beyond data. Then she moved slightly, not toward it, not away, but in a slow, deliberate arc that seemed to trace the edges of its presence. She examined the empty space between them, as if reading invisible lines in the air. The observer realized she was not merely noticing, it was more than recognition. She was understanding. And that was dangerous. Its species had never considered that the observed might ever understand the observer. They assumed curiosity, assumption, and fear, but understanding was a variable they had never accounted for. The observer's instruments detected the anomaly in emotional response. Its systems tried to categorize it, to assign a value, to normalize it. Nothing worked. The human's gaze and small movements generated interference in every protocol, like a ripple distorting the patterns of water. "You are not hiding," she said softly. The observer's sensors flickered. It had expected hesitation, denial, perhaps even alarm. But those were human traits it could measure, not this calm perception, this insight without evidence. It could not respond in words. It could not respond in gesture. Instead, it transmitted the smallest possible message it could produce, a pulse of light across a distance, an image so subtle that only one who paid attention could notice. She saw it immediately, and she understood. A smile formed on her lips again, faint and almost invisible. It was not joy, not surprise, not amusement. There was something, I had bet. It was acknowledgement. The observer realized with sudden clarity that the human had crossed a boundary it had thought impossible. She had reached into its presence and touched something inside it, something it had never intended to expose. All its training, all its experience, all its rules for observation were irrelevant. She had violated none of them, yet she had shattered the most fundamental expectation, that the observer could remain unseen and unaffected. She turned her gaze slightly upward, toward the stars. "Do you always watch us?" she asked quietly, almost to herself. The observer hesitated. Should it answer? Its species had precise definitions for interaction: contact, observation, warning, retreat. But none covered this, so it did nothing. She smiled faintly, accepting the silence. And in that silence, a new understanding formed, not in language, not in technology, but in presence. The observer's internal systems, designed to measure only physical variables, began registering something new: resonance. Not vibration, not energy, not light. Something deeper, like the pulse of a living thought. It realized humans were capable of connection without instruments, of awareness without evidence, of perception beyond logic. This understanding made them unpredictable, not dangerous in the usual sense, but transformative. It had observed countless worlds. It had cataloged countless species. None had altered its perception simply by noticing it. None had challenged its understanding by existing. Yet, here she was. And for the first time, the observer experienced hesitation. It could leave. It could return to its craft, report the anomaly as a minor variable, and continue its work. That was what protocol demanded. But it could not, because in that human's gaze was something more than recognition. It was an invitation not to speak. Not to act. Not to reveal secrets, but to exist together in the same space, acknowledging each other without violation, without threat, without expectation. Time stretched, and the observer felt something unfamiliar. It did not fully understand what it awaited, but it was drawn to the human again and again. A breach without sound, a connection without touch, a conversation without words. And in that connection, the observer realized something profound. Humans might not be ready for contact in the conventional sense, but in ways the galaxy had never measured, they were ready for something greater. The woman finally turned and began walking along the path, her steps soft but steady. She did not speak again. She did not beckon nor gesture. She simply moved, leaving the observer suspended in the night, caught between the impulse to leave and the desire to remain. It followed her, silently, adjusting its position just enough to remain unseen, but close enough to continue the observation. Every step she took, every subtle motion of her hands or head was recorded, analyzed, and felt. The night seemed to pulse with new energy. Every light, every shadow, every breeze was infused with the resonance of their silent exchange. Call. The observer realized with clarity that startled it that the human had changed the rules. The night was no longer routine. The night was no longer safe in the sense it had always understood. And yet, it was beautiful. For the first time, the observer experienced something it could not name. It had studied life. It had cataloged worlds. It had measured emotion, but never had it felt the simple, unquantifiable weight of being noticed, and of noticing in return. The human had done nothing remarkable in the usual sense. She had not spoken loudly. She had not acted aggressively. She had not drawn attention. She had only looked, and in doing so, had changed everything. And the observer knew, as the stars reflected in the water and the city lights flickered in the distance, that it would never see a night the same way again, because the breach had been made without sound, and the world had shifted quietly, profoundly, forever. The nights after the encounter became a pattern, though not one that the observer had planned. Every evening, as darkness crept over the city and the stars blinked awake, it returned to the river path. Not as a casual observer, not as a distant recorder, but with a sense of purpose it could not fully define. Humans went about their routines. Some ran along the paths, their footsteps echoing faintly against the pavement. Others leaned over the river's edge, tossing small stones into the water. Yet one always drew the observer's attention, the woman who had first looked into its eyes. She was consistent without being predictable. Some nights she walked alone. Other nights she sat quietly on a bench, watching the water, seemingly unaware of her surroundings. Sometimes she looked up at the stars, her expression calm and thoughtful. She was not searching for the observer in the usual sense. She did not move toward the invisible craft or attempt to signal it. She simply existed, fully present in the night. The observer noticed patterns in her behavior, but not the patterns it had been trained to detect. She did not repeat exact routines. She adjusted subtly, responding to the world around her. And through every subtle gesture, the observer realized something extraordinary. She understood it, not as a threat, not as an alien, not as a subject, but as a presence. Its systems, once precise and flawless, now struggled to classify the human. Years of training had taught the observer to categorize life forms by behavior, threat, and potential. Humans were noisy, emotional, and unpredictable, but never had one broken through observation without any physical action. She had done just that. It began to question its own species' assumptions. The Council, which oversaw the observer's mission, had considered humanity primitive. They assumed humans could not perceive beyond their immediate environment, could not sense what lay hidden, and would react irrationally to true contact. And yet this human had done all of these things. And without panic, without aggression, without even apparent curiosity. The observer began to suspect that humanity was more dangerous than its council believed. Not dangerous in the sense of destruction, but dangerous in the sense of awareness. She had noticed it. Not the craft, not the instruments, not the patterns. She had noticed it. One evening, she sat by the riverbank, her legs crossed, her hands resting gently on her knees. The observer adjusted its position, remaining hidden among the shadows of the trees. It had no reason to approach. It had no reason to communicate directly, and yet something inside it urged it closer. She looked up. As always, she found it immediately, as if it were the only thing she could see in the night. The observer felt a ripple it had no name for, a wave of awareness that traveled through its systems. "You are watching," she said softly. The observer did not respond. Words had never seemed adequate, but now even signals and images felt insufficient. How could it convey what it felt? Confusion, curiosity, even something like admiration? She smiled faintly, tilting her head as though she understood the impossibility of communication. She did not appear frustrated or impatient. She simply acknowledged its presence without expectation. The observer realized she had taught it something new, that communication could exist without language, without data, without direct contact. Presence alone was enough. Night after night, the observer followed her movements, mapping patterns that were never repeated exactly, noting gestures that seemed insignificant but carried meaning it could not yet decode. Each night it recorded subtle changes, the way her eyes reflected the moonlight, the rhythm of her breathing, the pauses she took before responding to nothing in particular. Each detail added to a growing realization. Humans were capable of understanding more than instruments could measure, more than its species could classify. It began to feel something approaching anticipation whenever she appeared. A system designed for detachment now operated under the influence of something it could not categorize. Its own presence seemed altered by hers, as though she had shifted the boundaries of reality around it. And then one night, the unexpected happened. She did not walk along the path. She did not sit quietly. She simply looked up at the sky, her gaze fixed on a point between the stars. The observer adjusted its sensors and discovered something remarkable. She was focusing not on the visible night, but on a region the human eyes should not have been able to see clearly. Curiosity surged through the observer. Could she see energy patterns invisible to the naked eye? Could she sense the subtle traces of its craft in the air? Its instruments had never recorded anything like this from a human. And yet, here she was, perceiving without tools, analyzing without instruments, understanding without explanation. The observer hovered closer, careful not to reveal itself. It was no longer merely an observer of behavior. It was an observer of understanding. She spoke, her voice calm and deliberate. You are not hiding. You never hide completely. The observer's systems flickered. No human had ever spoken with such accuracy about its presence. Its species had trained it to avoid detection, to maintain invisibility, to operate without interference. Yet this human perceived it anyway, as if she could read the world in ways that machines could not. She tilted her head slightly, watching the subtle movements of the craft. You are not alone, she said, almost as a statement rather than a question. The observer hesitated. How could it answer? Words would be meaningless. Signals would be misunderstood. Images could only convey partial truth. But it transmitted a small pulse of light anyway, a simple pattern meant to indicate presence without intention. She saw it. She nodded. And in that single motion, the observer felt something profound. She understood its existence in a way that did not require explanation. She did not demand knowledge. She did not question motives. She simply recognized being. It was unprecedented. The observer realized that the human's capacity for perception was not accidental. It was fundamental to her species. Humans did not require instruments to see the unseen. They did not need technology to feel the presence of another being. Their awareness extended beyond immediate perception into realms that the observer had assumed were inaccessible. It began to question its mission. The Council had assigned it to record, to observe, to evaluate. Humans were to be studied, cataloged, and assessed. And yet, it had discovered something the Council had never considered, a species capable of perception beyond calculation, of understanding beyond measurement, of noticing beyond expectation. This changed everything. Because if one human could perceive it so completely, what might others be capable of? What if humanity as a whole possessed this unseen ability, this unmeasured awareness? The observer realized that the Council's assumptions about danger, readiness, and potential were incomplete at best and dangerously flawed at worst. She rose to her feet, stretching lightly, her eyes still scanning the sky. The observer adjusted its position, hesitant to move too close. Yet it felt compelled to remain present, to maintain the silent dialogue that had grown between them. She spoke again, softly, almost to herself. You watch because you do not understand, and I watch because I can. The observer could not respond in words, but it transmitted a tiny pulse of light, indicating acknowledgement. She noticed, tilting her head, her lips curving faintly in what could only be called a smile. Time passed. The river flowed. The city breathed. The city breathed, and the observer understood something vital. Humans could perceive what the galaxy had assumed impossible. They could see the unseen, sense the unmeasured, and understand the incomprehensible. And in that realization, the observer felt a shift in purpose. Its mission had been to study, to report, to remain detached, but detachment was no longer possible. Presence alone had forged a connection too strong to ignore, a connection that defied protocol, logic, and training. It would continue to watch, not as a recorder of events, but as a witness to understanding. It would follow her movements, note her patterns, and attempt to grasp the depth of her perception. And in doing so, it began to see the potential of humanity, not as a primitive species, not as a chaotic civilization, but as something far greater than any protocol had imagined. The night stretched on, calm and quiet, but charged with meaning. Every shadow, every ripple of water, every distant sound carried resonance that the observer could feel but not name. Humanity had revealed a capacity that no machine could measure and no council could anticipate, and the observer knew, with a certainty it had never felt before, that everything had changed, not because of war, not because of conquest, not because of technology, but because a human had noticed. Because she had seen it. And because the species that notices can change the world. The night was quieter than usual. Even the river seemed to slow its flow, as if the world itself sensed that something had shifted. The city lights reflected on the water, tiny golden ribbons stretching toward the far bank. The observer hovered in its usual spot, concealed in the shadows, yet fully aware of the presence it had come to anticipate. She appeared again, her steps soft, almost floating over the path. She carried nothing, sought nothing, and yet seemed to command the night simply by being in it. The observer noted every detail, the way she paused at each bend of the river, the way her eyes traced invisible lines in the dark, the way her body seemed entirely at ease with the quiet world around her. It had followed her for many nights now, documenting patterns, recording gestures, and analyzing subtle movements. But this night was different. This night, the observer realized, would not be about observation alone. The woman stopped at the same bench where she had sat before. She lowered herself onto it and crossed her legs, resting her hands lightly on her knees. She tilted her head slightly, and for the first time the observer sensed a deliberate invitation, not to approach, not to speak, but to exist together in the same moment. The observer's systems, trained to detect only physical presence and measurable energy, began to register a new kind of resonance. It was subtle but unmistakable. A bond, a recognition, a connection that existed without language, without touch, without conventional communication. For the first time, the observer considered revealing itself, not fully, not physically, but in a way that could be perceived without instruments. Its species had protocols for contact, for first meetings, for diplomatic gestures, but none covered this kind of interaction, a silent acknowledgement between two beings from different worlds, built purely on attention and understanding. It hesitated, calculating every risk. The Council had strict rules. Contact without authorization was forbidden. Observation must remain detached. No interaction could influence the species under study. Yet every calculation faltered under the weight of what it felt. Presence alone had changed it. The human's awareness had shifted the observer's perception of its own mission. Slowly, it projected a small, shimmering pulse into the night. It was subtle, almost invisible, like a ripple across the water's surface. She saw it immediately. Her eyes widened for a fraction of a second, not in fear, but in comprehension. "You can be seen," she whispered, her voice carrying softly over the water, "even when you try not to be." The observer recorded the words, but more importantly, it felt them. They carried a truth no instrument could measure. She was not frightened. She did not demand answers. She simply acknowledged reality. It hovered closer, careful not to reveal its form fully, yet allowing the smallest hint of its presence to reach her senses. And in that moment, the observer realized something profound. Humanity's strength was not in technology, or in armies, or in conquest. Their strength was in awareness, in understanding, in empathy, and in the courage to see what others could not. She tilted her head, her eyes reflecting the moonlight, as though considering this unspoken revelation. Then she smiled, a small, quiet smile that carried no judgment, no expectation, only recognition. "You notice me," she said softly, "and I notice you." The observer felt a ripple through its systems. Never before had it been recognized so completely. Not by instruments, not by logic, not by calculation, but by a conscious being, one who could see it, understand it, and accept its existence without fear or aggression. For the first time, the observer understood that humanity was not primitive. Humanity was not limited. Humanity was extraordinary, not because they could conquer or destroy, but because they could perceive, understand, and connect in ways that defied expectation. And in this quiet exchange, the observer realized that the rules it had followed for decades, rules of detachment, rules of observation, rules of strict protocol, were incomplete. They had never accounted for a species capable of seeing beyond the physical, sensing beyond the measurable, and acknowledging beyond the known. It projected another pulse, slightly brighter this time, and she responded with a small nod, almost imperceptible. It was enough. Presence alone had spoken more clearly than any words could. The observer reflected on its previous reports to the council. Humanity had always been described as chaotic, unpredictable, and emotional. They were noted for their curiosity, their resilience, and their tendency to challenge patterns. But the woman had proven something the council had never considered, that humanity's awareness was not a flaw, but a gift that could change worlds. She rose from the bench, stretching lightly, her gaze lingering on the shimmering pulse of light that marked the observer's presence. She did not speak. She did not reach out. She did not demand anything. She simply walked along the path, her movements calm and deliberate, leaving the observer to follow silently. And yet, the observer felt that nothing would ever be the same again. The night, which had once been a backdrop for routine observation, had transformed into a space of understanding and connection. Every shadow, every ripple in the water, every faint sound carried a new meaning. It hovered closer, its presence now partially revealed. A small shimmer in the corner of perception, a hint of form, a whisper of being. She noticed immediately, tilting her head with the same quiet comprehension that had first unsettled it. "You are here," she said softly, "and I am here." No further words were needed. The night itself seemed to acknowledge the exchange, the water reflecting the city lights with unusual clarity, the stars seeming to shimmer in approval. Presence alone had bridged the gap between two species. Two beings from different worlds had recognized each other without threat, without expectation, without violation. The observer realized that the council's assumptions about contact were flawed. They believed that intelligence could be measured by technology, that civilization could be judged by progress, that understanding required instruments. But humans did not require measurement to perceive truth. They did not require authority to recognize awareness. They did not require power to understand presence. This realization changed the observer's mission completely. Its reports would not describe humans as chaotic or emotional or primitive. Its reports would describe a species capable of seeing beyond the immediate, understanding beyond the measurable, and connecting beyond expectation, and that knowledge was far more important than any data point the council had ever requested. The woman paused by the river's edge, looking out at the water. She did not speak. She did not move. She simply existed, and in her existence, she had changed everything. The observer hovered silently, fully aware that this night marked a turning point. It would continue to observe, of course, but observation was no longer passive. Observation was now a witness to understanding, a record of connection, a chronicle of perception. Humanity had demonstrated a power that no weapon, no technology, no calculation could match. The power to notice, to recognize, and to understand. She glanced back briefly, her eyes catching the faint shimmer of its presence. For the first time, the observer felt a kind of gratitude, not for itself, not for recognition, but for the opportunity to witness what it had thought impossible. "You change everything," she said softly, almost to herself. "Just by noticing." The observer remained still, absorbing the statement. It had never considered that observation could lead to transformation. But here it was. Humanity had transformed not through conquest or fear, but through awareness. And in that transformation, the observer felt hope, a rare, fragile, and profound hope. Not for itself, not for its mission, but for the species it had come to understand. Humanity had passed an invisible threshold, one the galaxy had never measured. They were ready not for dominance, but for understanding. Not for war, but for connection. The night stretched on. The river flowed quietly. The city hummed in the distance. And two beings, from different worlds, different species, different understandings, shared the same space, acknowledged each other, and changed the night forever. For the first time, the observer understood that the galaxy's measure of greatness might never be found in power, in technology, or in conquest. It might be found in awareness, in empathy, in the quiet courage to notice what others cannot, and humanity had already begun to show that courage. As she walked away, leaving only footprints in the soft earth, the observer remained, silently watching, silently acknowledging, silently recording the most important discovery of its life. The night would end. The city would return to routine. But the observer knew that nothing would ever be the same. Humanity had revealed a power beyond measure. And the galaxy, if it could see, would never underestimate them again, because she had looked straight into its eyes. And the night, the observer, and the world had been forever changed.